We're excited to announce an exclusive 24-hour flash sale on Colson Center National Conference tickets. Use code FLASH23 to receive 20% off ticket pricing if you purchase tickets within the next 24 hours. The conference is being held May 19th through the 21st, 2023 in Indianapolis at the JW Marriott downtown. Secure your spot for our flagship Christian Worldview Conference featuring speakers like Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute, Kristen Wagoner of Alliance Defending Freedom, and our own John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center, plus many more. This 24-hour 20% off flash sale concludes on Wednesday, March 22nd at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. You must use the code FLASH23 at checkout. Please note, this offer includes all conference sessions except the Wilberforce Awards Dinner. Details and event registration can be found at colsonconference.org. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. In one of the punchiest passages of his masterpiece, Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton notes the strange way unbelievers seem able to criticize Christianity for opposite reasons. Quote, "It looked not so much as if Christianity was bad enough to include any vice, but rather as if any stick was good enough to beat Christianity with. What again could this astonishing thing be like, which people were so anxious to contradict that in doing so, they didn't mind contradicting themselves?" He went on to list the critiques. Is Christianity too dismissive of the family with monasticism and Jesus' talk of leaving father and mother? Or does it force family upon us with its sexual morality? Is it anti-woman or just a women's religion? Does it fetishize poverty, sackcloth, and meekness? Or are its cathedrals and altars too opulent? Is it too plain or too colored? Too sexually repressed or obsessed with sex? Too magical and superstitious or too dogmatic and closed-minded? Skeptics seemed happy to make all of these contradictory charges against Christianity, sometimes in the same breath. Chesterton concludes that Christian orthodoxy is functioning on a level its critics simply don't understand, that it is working in a three-dimensional moral universe when the philosophies of this world work in two dimensions, that Christianity can shatter these false dichotomies. And though Chesterton gives only a brief list of examples, my guest today has written 600 pages of them. Dr. Christopher Watkin is an associate professor in French studies at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. He's the author of several academic and public works, but his latest promises to be a defining work for him. It's called Biblical Critical Theory: How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Modern Life and Culture. And I welcome him today to talk about that. Christopher Watkin, welcome to Upstream.
Thank you so much, Shane. I must say that I fear we may have peaked early. I think that Chesterton quote has encapsulated better than I can a lot of the concerns of the book, and I'll try to live up to it if I can for the rest of our time together.
You know, I just couldn't help, and to be fair, to be clear, the second half there was paraphrased. I forgot to say unquote, but I couldn't help thinking as I'm reading your book that it's exactly what you're doing. It's sort of, you're taking these false dilemmas, right? The moral poles that our culture throws out and says, you got to be one or the other. You got to choose this or that, and doing what you call diagonalizing them. And we'll get into that. But it really seems as if Christianity and Scripture, our Bible, has the resources to see around a lot of these false dilemmas, that it has the ability to say, no, it's not an either or, it's a both and you guys are missing it because your worldview is too small. And in that respect, you know, it's a very Augustinian project, what you're doing here. And it also is very powerful and winsome because it doesn't require people denounce their values.
I think that's half right. It is a both and, but it's also, and this is the genius of it, I think, the genius of the Bible that I'm trying to frame in this idea of diagonalization. It's also a neither nor. And I think you find this in 1 Corinthians 1, where Paul is dealing with Greek wisdom and the Jewish demand for signs. So he's very clear, on the one hand, that the foolishness of God is not what the Greeks think is wisdom. There's an antithesis there. And this is the neither nor. So what God is offering you is not wisdom as you see wisdom at the moment. There's a an unbridgeable gulf between the gospel and your values. There's an antithesis. But then a couple of verses later, and this is the brilliance of it, he says that the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. And so it's as if at that point he's got this scale of wisdom and he's plotted Greek wisdom somewhere down near the bottom. And then he takes God's foolishness and he tries to put it on the same scale. And oh, lo and behold, it's right up at the top. So it is actually wiser than the wisdom that you're seeking. And the brilliance of that passage is that he does both of those things. Because we're good as Christians, I think, at doing either one or the other. So some of us and some types of Christianity are really good at saying there's a clear blue water between the gospel and culture. The gospel is not the same as the culture. This is not just a sort of a warmed over version of cultural values. And those are the sort of people who will often denounce what's happening in culture. And then there's another group that try and get alongside culture and contextualize and say the things that you're desiring, dear late modern people, are actually good biblical things. You just need to desire them with a bit of Christ dust sprinkled on them, and then you'll be fine. And what both of those sides do is they simplify this brilliant Pauline way of engaging with culture, which has both antithesis and fulfillment, both neither wisdom nor signs. It's not what I'm offering you. And actually, both a greater wisdom than you ever imagined and more power than you could ever conceive. And it's being able to hold those two together that I think is, if you like, the holy grail of this Pauline cultural critique. It's just brilliant as he does it. And then, as you were rightly saying, as Augustine does it later on as well.
Well, this is drawing us back to one of the central, I guess, strategies of Christian cultural engagement, Christian evangelism, Christian teaching of the Bible that, like you said, goes back to very ancient origins. Paul himself, and then, of course, Augustine is one of the famous figures who does this sort of thing. And you cite him explicitly as the city of God is actually his work that kind of brings us in this direction, uses this technique. But I want to set the stage here by kind of tackling an opposition that we Christians ourselves sometimes fall into, especially if we consider ourselves consciously contrary to the culture, right? We're kind of embattled as a minority. We're looking at the outside culture and we're thinking we have to offer something radically different. So we look at the culture and we think that's the city of destruction. We're on our way to the celestial city. Nary the two shall meet. You know, they are as different gets. And on one register, like you said, that is true. But Christianity also has this ability to speak into the created longings, goals, desires, and goods that unbelievers, members of false religions, or even secularists and atheists are seeking. And those resources, I think, are often underutilized in especially conservative circles. And so if you could kind of explain what that posture looks like, and then allay concerns in my listeners that what we're doing here is really just compromising with the world in some way.
So the first half of your question, I think the posture can look quite different in different cultural contexts. So if we look at what Augustine in the City of God is doing, he is telling the story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation in the second half of that book in a way that shows that Rome's stories about itself are really quite shallow and inadequate and have holes in them. And he's doing what John Milbank would call out-narrating Rome. He's explaining Rome to the Romans better than the Romans understand themselves. And that's one way that this can work. To allay the fears of people who think that there's a compromise with culture, I guess there are three things to say. The first is that it's a good fear to have. That is not something we want to do. We don't want to sell out to any particular culture and to hitch the cart of the gospel to any particular cultural horse, because as soon as you do that, you exclude all the other cultures and your gospel becomes sort of bound and tied up within one particular culture, and it becomes really quite imperial and colonial quite quickly. So it's a good fear to have, and it's a good thing to walk through that and to think carefully about. Secondly, I think the first thing to say to that fear is that we see the authors of both the New and the Old Testament engaging with culture in really rich ways, in a way that doesn't compromise the gospel. So when Paul explains the gospel to Greek philosophers, he uses very different language. and concepts to how he explains it to pagan people in the countryside. And that's not because it's a different gospel. And that's not because he's selling out. It's because God's rich truth can find a home in every human culture in a way that isn't sort of diminishing that gospel. And I think there's rich biblical warrant for doing that. And I think finally that the fear of sort of shackling the gospel to a particular culture forgets sometimes that God was there first. So original cultures don't own in any ultimate way the ways that they think about the world, because everything is derivative of God's ultimate truth. And so, for example, the way that we think about freedom in late modernity is one of our prized values. George Lakoff wrote a book on freedom, and he said it's America's something like most cherished value or most important value. Now, this is key to the way that we see ourselves as late moderns. We are the free, and those who are seeking greater freedoms for ourselves and greater freedoms for the people.
Well, over here, we're brave too. Just don't forget that.
That's right. And where does that come from? Where does that whole idea of seeking freedom in the way that we understand it and liberation as a key idea in our identity come from? Well, it comes substantially, in large part, from the Exodus narrative. If you look at ancient civilizations, there's one of them that prizes liberation as a foundational identity marker, and that is the Hebrew nation. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Israel, out of the land of slavery, on evil's wings. That is who you are. You are the freed ones. And in books like Exodus and Revolution by Michael Walzer and Exodus and Liberation by John Coffey, they trace this trope through how Exodus has shaped modernity really profoundly, shaped our politics, shaped our sense of identity, our view of ourselves, our view of our society. And therefore, if we say, well, how does the gospel relate to this key aspect of our culture, which is the desire for freedom? Well, that is already, if you like, a Christian heresy. It's derivative of a fundamental biblical theme, but it's twisted it and it's taken it out of context and it's changed it. So it's not exactly exotic. But what we're doing is we're not encountering something that's utterly alien to the Bible to begin with.
This reminds me again of a book that I've referred to frequently on the podcast for the last couple of years. And I had him on after he wrote the book, Tom Holland's Dominion. One of the moves that he makes there that really, I think, should be foundational to any modern Christian's engagement with their culture, especially if they're in a Western context, is that Western civilization as it exists now in its secular post-Christian form is not isolated from the Christian story. It comes out of the Christian story. It has been exposed to the Christian story and in many ways has been deeply shaped by it, so that there are resonances that Christianity still has with the West and the values people cherish here, even though they've renounced it on paper. And in many ways, he argues, we're still telling ourselves the Christian story, which is rooted, right, in that Exodus story in the early parts of the Bible. And so that has to, on top of the sort of human critique that happens here, where we're all human beings, we all want certain things, right? There's also an additional level to what you're doing because we're Western human beings. You and I are Western human beings, and much of what this book addresses are Western controversies and moral values. So you're speaking into the lives of people whose memories include Christian values, whether they know it or not. And that adds to the profundity of the dynamic that you're talking about here.
I think that's right. One thing I really appreciate about Tom Holland's book is the way that he frames contemporary cultural debates and disagreements as intra-theological. One part of the Christian tradition is set up in opposition to another part, and they're fighting it out both on, if you like, biblical ground, but different biblical dynamics. The way that I try to put it in the book is that we live in an ironic age. And what I'm trying to get at with that is that there's more than one thing going on, and you can't understand contemporary society only in terms of one dynamic. But one of the things is that we are certainly, in the way that we think of ourselves as late moderns, walking away from any religious mooring. So if you ask people, do you think Christianity hugely affect how you see the world? I think most people would say no, it really has very little effect at all. And so there's that superficial secularity. But as you're rightly saying, there's a really deep sense in which our most cherished ideas about ourselves are drawing heavily on Christian and biblical influences and growing in Christian soil. And I think that's quite new. So we've had secular societies before, like Rome was very profoundly not Christian. And so Christians have sort of worked out how to live in societies that have no idea who they are and haven't the first thing in common. And we've sort of been in societies that thought themselves Christian and where Christianity was made much of publicly, regardless of what sort of Christianity it was and whether Jesus would have welcomed that way if he'd have walked into that Christianity or not. But what we're facing is something rather new, which is both of those at the same time, a society thinking that it is secular while being really very deeply and inextricably biblical in a strange way at the same time. And that's hard to deal with because you can't simply denounce it because then you're denouncing these heretically framed, but nevertheless profoundly Christian values. But neither do you want to simply embrace it because those values have been uprooted and planted in a different ecosystem and no longer doing the work that they did in a biblical frame. It's really complex.
Dr. Watkin, I think that what you're doing in many ways here is reintroducing a secular Western audience to the book that formed them. This book is structured around the Bible itself. It follows the storyline of the Bible, and then it tackles contemporary moral debates and dichotomies through the lens of Scripture and tries to read it that way. And, in light of that, I think we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question before we set out to do this engagement. Like, before we as Christians pick up a book like this and start to try to make the moves that you recommend, as the dust jacket says, we have to ask ourselves, how do our non-Christian neighbors or post-Christian neighbors look at the Bible? What do you think that modern people see when they look at it? Because I don't think they see what you're doing with it in this book.
That is a fascinating question, Shane. I suspect there are many, many different answers to it, and that there are different subcultures within late modern culture that view the Bible very differently. I think for a large portion of people, they simply don't. I'm not sure that they could tell you there are two testaments. I'm not sure that they could tell you whether Moses comes before or after Jesus. I'm not sure whether they could tell you that Moses is a character in the Bible or not. I think there's a very profound and rapidly gained biblical illiteracy, which, just to say a word on that for a moment, I think whether or not you're a Christian, there is something valuable that is lost through that. And it's partly this idea of a common culture, right? But I think in a pluralistic society, that argument only takes you so far. But it's also the sense of being able to understand oneself. I think we make much, and rightly so, of preserving the cultural heritage of non-Western cultures. I have colleagues here who work on Aboriginal cultures, and they're doing fantastic work trying to make sure that the language and the stories of those cultures don't die out. And the impulse behind that is that something is lost to the patrimony of the whole of humanity, not just to those individual communities, if we let that distinctive way of being human in the world and that distinctive tradition that's sort of built up over the centuries simply disappear. And I think in a similar way, you don't have to be a Christian to see an impoverishment in biblical illiteracy. Like, people who don't know whether Moses came before or after Jesus are not able to engage with the huge treasures that came out of that tradition in a way that they would if they could. Things like Shakespeare and so forth, but not just high culture. It's a particular way of understanding the world that has been profoundly formative for millions, perhaps billions of people over the years, that if we cut ourselves off from the text that is in the center of that formation, I think we impoverish ourselves regardless of our religious affiliation. Not to mention that for Christians, it's such a tragedy because, these are the words of eternal life.
Yeah. I mean, I think that if you were to show so far from high culture, if you were to show Avengers Endgame to like a Viking in the early Middle Ages, they wouldn't have understood what's going on there, because first of all, they would have been like, why is Thor acting like such a little ninny? You know, what is this nonsense? And then second, they wouldn't have understood the self-sacrifice of Tony Stark, you know, at the end there. Sorry, everyone who hasn't seen it, I just gave you a big spoiler. But the point is, there are values there that are just assumed, and I'm not even sure the folks behind the movie or the majority of those watching the movie understand what kind of magic is working on them there, why it is that they resonate with that and go, yes, self-sacrifice, that's the thing right there. That's the way the story should end. But it's because of Christianity. Another spoiler alert there. It's because they've still got those imaginations that are latent or like, I guess, shaped in a residual way.
And that is, I think that's an incredibly important point. And that is one reason why I think it's helpful. One helpful apologetic move for Christians to be making today is to try and help people to see that the way that they see the world is not obvious or simply common sense. And I think whatever the hegemonic ideology is in a particular society, and for the longest time in the West, it was Christianity. So this was our problem for a long time as Christians. But it's now shifting, and it's some sort of secular view of the world. Whatever the hegemonic ideology is, it's really easy to think that that's simply ground zero, that that's not ideological, that everybody starts off thinking like me, and then some people get weird down the line. And I think that's the trickiness for secularism at the moment, because it's all over. You know, you wake up, it's all over your phone in implicit ways. It's in all the advertising, in all the media that we see. There's this implicit assumption of secularism. And so you can go through the whole decade never really being challenged or put on the spot about that. And so you begin to think, as Christians thought in the past, well, this is just obvious. Like, why can't other people see that there's no God? Like, it's just blindingly, crushingly clear. And what you don't realize is your own cultural situatedness. And so one service that Christians can provide, I think, today is to help people who are part of this hegemonic ideology to see that the way that anybody sees the world, including you, doesn't just sort of fall from the sky in some prepackaged way. There's a history to it. There are moves that have been made that could have been made otherwise that lead to you seeing the world in the way that you do. And until people get an inkling of that, I think it's really hard for anyone to conceive of changing the way they see the world. And because so many people have no inkling of that today, it's not surprising that people just see Christianity as an absolute irrelevant. Like, it's not even the question of whether it's true is not even a proper question. You know, it's like saying, to take the classic example, is the flying spaghetti monster true? Well, I cannot entertain that question seriously because it's just so far-fetched from my point of view. And so helping people to see, and Francis Schaeffer was really good at this, that the way you see the world is not simply common sense and everybody else is weird. And the more you think about that, the more, sort of arrogant that shows itself to be as a way of thinking about the world. And the more it plays into a lot of the huge geopolitical issues that we faced in the 20th century and that caused so much damage, thinking, well, my view is simply obvious and everybody should be like me. And, if we need to force them to do that, then let's force them because this is just so mind-numbingly clear. And it's something that Christians need to do as well. There are Christian subcultures, I think, where we forget the weirdness of Christianity and lose the ability to explain it to people who don't share our assumptions. So it's not just a one-way thing. Everybody needs to realize that the way we see the world isn't obvious to everybody, and the people who disagree with us aren't simply trying to be perverse. That there are more dynamics in play than that.
My favorite is the ironclad assumption that you run up against with secular neighbors, coworkers, family members, that if somebody wants to do something and it's not obviously hurting someone else, then it should be fine. It should be allowed. That's the Mill's harm principle, right?
Well, that's exactly right. And so it's incredibly important then to point out exactly in the way that you've done that, hey, that idea has a history.
And most people throughout history have not thought that.
Yeah. Then John Stuart Mill came along and he had his particular situation, he had his particular issues he was working through with his father and so forth. And, he brought out this idea, and then a lot of people thought it was so, and just showing people that it is a situated idea. It has its history, and it came up in a particular context for a particular reason. It's just really helpful.
Doesn't mean it's wrong necessarily. It just means it's not obvious to everyone by default. And that's a huge step to take. Okay, so I want to talk about Augustine here briefly, because near the beginning of your book, you've got this comparison where you show the moves Augustine makes in City of God. It's kind of just two parts is really what he does there. And then you compare it to the structure of what you're trying to do. Explain to us, for those who aren't familiar, what it is Augustine did with the cultural critique in his day, and then how it parallels the project that you are attempting in this book.
The brilliance of the City of God. Now, I really do think it is the blazing sun of Christian cultural critique still, all these centuries later. It is the standard for rich Christian cultural critique. In the first half, he surveys the whole of Roman culture. And you might think, well, there's nothing particularly amazing about that. But I really think it is incredibly important that he looks at the whole of it. So he's not just thinking of himself as something like a SWAT team that parachutes into a particular problematic part of Roman culture and dismantles it and then airlifts himself out afterwards. He recognizes that the whole thing is an ecosystem. So there's the Roman gods and goddesses and the pantheon. There's the games and the entertainments. There's the politics. There's the Roman spectacle and so forth. And he joins all the dots. He says, look, all of this works together. And actually, some of it doesn't work together. There's a contradiction between this bit over here and that bit over there. And unless you try and range over the whole thing, you can't do that. I think one of the dangers of contemporary Christian cultural critique is that we tend to zero in this particular thing or that particular thing in society that we think is egregiously unchristian, as if that was the only thing that was wrong. And we lose this sense of an ecosystem that no ideas spring up out of nowhere. They, again, to pick up what we were saying a moment ago, they all have a history and they all have other assumptions that they rely on in order to become plausible. And so he's brilliant at that in the first half of the City of God. And then in the second half, what he does brilliantly is he brings the whole of the Bible to bear on the whole of Roman culture that he surveyed in the first half. And the fantastic thing about that, and the reason that it's such a pattern for us, I think, is that it gives him an incredibly rich, deep, and subtle critique of Rome. So if he'd sort of picked out his favorite verses and said, let's try and read Roman culture through these, he'd have been able to make some headway, but it would necessarily have been a skewed view of the Bible, because there'd have been huge tracts of the Bible that he'd have been leaving out. But he takes us through this huge arc of creation, fall, and redemption, and brings that whole story to bear on Roman culture in a way that I think makes him more faithful to the overall sweep of the Bible than he could possibly be if he just did a few passages. But it also allows, one way of putting it, I suppose, would be it allows the Bible to shine. Because one really distinctive thing about a biblical view of the world, and for people who want to sort of chase up bibliography, this is Herman Doiviet is really good on this in The Roots of Western Culture, is that most views of the world frame themselves to a large extent in terms of fundamental dichotomies. So Doiviet will say, for the Greeks, it's matter and form. And obviously, he's particularly thinking of Plato and Aristotle. And then in the medieval period, it's nature and grace. And for us moderns, he would say it's nature and freedom. And the thing about those dichotomies is they're static. They don't change over time. But the Christian view of the world, Doiviet argues, and Augustine models in The City of God, is dynamic. It's a story. It's creation, fall, redemption. And that is not just a different approach to the world, to the others. It's qualitatively distinct. It's not just a different dichotomy. It is not a dichotomy anymore. It's a story. Augustine then allows himself to layer palimpsestically, if that's a word, these layers of the story.
It's definitely not a word I've heard before.
No, I suspect it's not a word in the dictionary either. Let's say like a palimpsest. in a palimpsest-like way.
You have to define the second word, though, because I still don't know what that is.
A palimpsest is one text that's been written over another text.
Okay.
So a layered text. So in the ancient world, papyrus was so expensive that you wouldn't sort of throw it away and get a new sheet of papyrus. You'd sort of write over the text below, and that's a palimpsest. And in the same way, the biblical story then builds itself up a little bit like a palimpsest in the sense that there's creation, we're created in the image of God, and then there's the fall, and the fall doesn't completely obliterate creation. There's still a sense in which human beings are in the image of God, but now we're also sinful. And that's, if you like, written over the top of creation. And then when redemption comes, it doesn't mean we're not sinful anymore, at least not before glorification. It simply means that we are now those created in the image of God who have sinned, who are in Christ, for whom now there is no condemnation and so forth, and who will be free of the presence of sin in the future. And so it's layers upon layers upon layers. And what these other views of the world can't do is layer things story fashion in that way. And the brilliance of taking the approach that Augustine does in the second half of the City of God, walking you through the Bible, is that it allows that story to be a story and to articulate a view of human beings and society that is dimensionally richer than the view that you're critiquing.
And so Augustine lived 1,500 odd years ago. We need an update, so to speak, humbly, and recognizing that nobody alive today is quite Augustine. We need something that addresses not ancient Rome, but our time through the biblical story. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, we absolutely need to say I am not claiming to be updating the City of God. Like anyone who claims that, just smile at them and walk away. This is a huge epoch-making work of cultural critique, and what I am trying to do is follow the biblical pattern that Augustine himself followed, and to do it in a very derivative way. The one way I've described it in the past is if the City of God is a blazing sun, then I'm trying to hold a flickering candle to it. But in a sense, one can feel empowered to do that because Augustine himself is not making things up from nowhere. He is doing the 1 Corinthians 1 thing, not necessarily quoting that passage, but that's what he's doing. And therefore, we're seeking, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ, follow what Augustine is doing in the City of God to the extent that is following a biblical pattern.
And there's a implicit assumption at work here too that I think is profoundly Christian, and that is that the Bible is not simply a story isolated in the mists of the deep past, an obscure text from an ancient Near East culture that has little to do with us without some ingenious application. That the Bible actually has the power to speak into our culture with the same potency with which it spoke into Augustine's culture in the late Western Roman Empire, and that we are invited every bit as much as 21st century Christians to apply the scriptural story to our cultures and to compare and contrast just as much as Augustine was, just as much as Paul was.
And in a sense, even more so, because our society over the centuries has been so profoundly formed by this story in a way that Augustine's hadn't yet, that there's a case for saying any late modern simply can't understand herself unless she has a grasp on this storyline. We are opaque to ourselves. We're a mystery to ourselves, to use a sort of Augustinian turn of phrase, unless we have some sort of sense of how this story has shaped us individually. Indeed, as individuals, the very concept of the individual, this is Larry Siedentop's work, comes out of a Pauline moment originally. We can't even understand our individualism.
We can't even understand secularism.
Completely. Absolutely. Yeah, all of that. And so we impoverish ourselves, whether we're Christian or not, if we don't understand this text. And then for the Christians, how much more is it important to understand it, given that, all scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, and that it's the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. So, there are good arguments for everyone getting across this. And for Christians, there are increased compelling arguments for trying to help people to understand.
I'm talking today with Dr. Christopher Watkin, author of the new book, Biblical Critical Theory: How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Modern Life and Culture. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this. Has Upstream helped make your worldview bigger and older? Maybe something you've heard on the show has shaped the way you view your calling, habits, vocation, or recreation. We want to hear from you. Visit colsoncenter.org/up-listeners to leave us a short audio message. We look forward to hearing from you. We're back on Upstream talking with Christopher Watkin about his new book, Biblical Critical Theory: How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Modern Life and Culture. Dr. Watkin, I almost always make it all the way through a book before doing a podcast, but I got a confession here. I'm on page 207 with some sneaky and strategic peeking ahead. Of course, this is a 600-page long book, so I've got a ways to go. But the structure is very consistent, and that really helps. Each chapter is wrapped around a kind of false dichotomy or a set of false dichotomies that we learn to believe from our culture. And you do something that you call diagonalizing with those false dichotomies in the story of the Bible. Could you explain that to us?
The best way to explain it is with an example. And I think that the best example that I found that makes it the clearest is right from the beginning of the Bible, in the image of God motif. So let's start with the motif and then look what modern society does and then come back to what diagonalization is. So the image of God motif has at least two really important things that it's doing. The first one is that it's dignifying human beings. Of everything in the whole created order, only human beings are in the image of God. So a beautiful concerto is not in the image of God. A wonderful sunset is not in the image of God. The most cherished home pet, an animal, is not, according to Genesis 1, in the image of God. And so there's an incredible dignity and worth ascribed to human beings through this image. But there's also a humbling of human beings in this same image of God, because precisely we're not God. We are the image of God. We're contingent, we're derivative. In order to understand us, you need to know the God in whose image we are. We're not self-defining. And there's no sense in the image of God motif that these two things are in conflict with one another. It's not that we're sort of half dignified, but that comes to a screeching halt at some point, and then, oh no, now we're being humbled and we can't have the dignity anymore. There's a harmony between the exaltation and the humbling.
And this is true even before the fall.
Absolutely, yeah, Genesis 1. And there's a sense in which modern anthropologies reflect in a strange way, usually one or another of those impetuses. So there's a very important strand of modern anthropology that will say we need to understand that we are nothing more than sophisticated machines. We may not like the idea, but we need, in Bertrand Russell's language, to open the windows and let the cold air of truth come rushing in and realize that we're just machines. And we may kid ourselves that there's something special about us, but there isn't. Or sometimes it will come out in the language that we're simply like the other animals. We're a more sophisticated animal, but there's nothing qualitatively different about it. And then and that reflects the idea of a humbling. And there's an echo of truth that is getting at. Human beings were created on the same day as the animals in Genesis 1. We are on the creature side of the creator-creature distinction. So there's something there that is reaching for. And then there's another strand of late modern anthropology, which sets us up really like gods, or ascribes to humans the things that traditionally only gods did, like defining reality for ourselves, for example. You should shape the world, in a sense, around yourself. You should forge your own way in life and make it all work for you. You should decide what is good and evil for yourself. Well, that's something that traditionally gods did. Not simply Christian gods, but gods in all sort of traditions. They were the ones who decided what was good and evil. You should decide the meaning of your existence for yourself. That's something that gods traditionally did. And so systematically, and John Milbank is really good on this in the opening chapters of Theology and Social Theory, systematically, the things that were hitherto God things have become human things. And we're set up as these particular sorts of gods for whom nothing can stand in the way of our will, sort of a voluntarist idea of God. And
this is where you get the Invictus poem.
That sort of thing, yeah. And the idea that you can be whatever you want to be. That's your will. This is voluntarism. Your will is all powerful, all supreme. And within the theological tradition of voluntarism, that there are resources for articulating this quite powerfully. So, the voluntarists, for example, will say that if God wants 2 + 2 to equal 36, then he can. If that is his will, logic cannot stand in the way of his will. It's this utterly unstoppable idea of the will that's sort of been inscribed into humans. So you make your identity for yourself, you make your meaning for yourself, the meaning of life for yourself. Anything you want to be, you can be it because nothing can stand in the way of your will. You're a voluntarist God. And so modernity presents us, if you like, these two anthropologies. And so, you are nothing more than a machine. Oh, and also, by the way, you're a voluntarist God for whom nothing can stand in the way of your will, not even reality. Now, take these two ideas and go away and live your life in peace and harmony, please. It's a psychologically very burdensome position to find oneself in. And both of these ideas have some faint echo of biblical truth in them. So I think what this voluntarist idea is trying to get at is that there's something special about human beings. There is a dignity about humans. There is a special role that we've been given. Adam names the animals and so forth. There's something distinct and God-like about us. The Bible would never say that we are God, but there's something God-like. And also there's something humbling about us, something animal-like about us, created on the same day. And so we come to those two anthropologies as late modern Christians, and what do we do with them? Well, what we don't do is split the difference and say, oh, well, okay, then we must be half machines and half gods. And is everybody happy now? Well, nobody's happy now. That's a if I may make so bold, a stupid position. It doesn't make sense. And it is very unbiblical to say that we're half machines and half gods. But that's what some people think diagonalization is. It's always splitting the difference and meeting in the middle. That's not what it's about. To diagonalize that dichotomy would be to say, well, hold on. You've both got dismembered limbs of a beautiful biblical body here. You've taken something that's there in Genesis 1, you've ripped it out of its context, you've made it the whole thing, and you've set it up against something else that's been ripped out of its Genesis 1 context, made the whole thing. And now you're battling out between yourselves, over here, we're machines. No, we're not, we're gods. And it's like, stop. What you need to do is realize that you're both peddling reductive heresies of a beautiful biblical harmonious truth. And to diagonalize it is to say that. It's to say, stop being reductive. Look at how these things harmoniously work together in the Bible. Let's repatriate them. Let's find our creatureliness. Let's let our creatureliness find its true biblical context in the biblical ecosystem of ideas, and let human exaltation find its true biblical context in the biblical ecosystem of ideas. And therefore, to diagonalize is it's more like a first way. Like God's way was the first way. The image of God comes first, and then late modernity butchers it and mangles it. And so we're saying, can we get back to that first way, please? Rather than, some sort of, the language that's often used, isn't it, is third way, which gives the impression that the dichotomy comes first, and then you've got to figure out what to do with it after the fact, which is not, I think, a biblical way of going about things.
Well, folks, Dr. Watkin does that with dozens and dozens and dozens of dichotomies. I can't emphasize enough how the richness of what you just heard is what he brings to every single one of the cultural dichotomies that our time throws at us, and then applies biblical wisdom to those dichotomies in a way that, as Chesterton said, and this is what actually tipped me off to the kind of Chestertonian attitude in your approach here, is that we're not splitting the difference, like you said. We're taking both things in their full and fiery intensity, and we're affirming them, because what we're talking about is not a contradiction. It's a paradox. And as R.C. Sproul of blessed memory taught me very early on in my studies as a high schooler, a paradox is not the same thing as a logical contradiction. A paradox just appears that way when you have a limited perspective. But if you can adopt the proper perspective, as so many simple optical illusion graphics can show you, paradoxes resolve. They become actually coherent, and the both sides of them join up together in their fiery fullness and intensity. That's a great example.
And there's an interesting point to make in relation to that, which is that sort of paradox can be wrangled with in a Christian frame in a way that's very hard to do in a secular frame. So as Christians, we have the ability, because of the way that we think the world is and that God is not part of this world, to say, there is a mystery here that I do not understand, and yet it is understood. And I think that I will understand it one day. Our knowledge of the world is not the only knowledge that there is. So if I'm in the immanent frame, as Charles Taylor would say, and I don't understand something, that is all that there is to be said about it. It is a thing that is not understood. It is a thing that does not make sense, because there is no mind other than our human mind that is being brought to bear on it. And that leaves you with another dichotomy, I suppose. It leaves you either having to say everything that can be known is known, and therefore we have some sort of purchase on the universe, or there is an irreducible mystery, and this universe is fundamentally chaotic because it cannot be fully known. And if you don't fully know something, then you're not in possession of the knowledge of whether it's coherent finally or not. And so you get, philosophers, just to cut a very long story short, like Spinoza, essentially saying, look, everything pretty much is known. Like we know everything. And other philosophers who resolve to a very sort of existentially and epistemologically inadequate mystery. But we as Christians can say, I do not understand this, and yet I know that it is not chaotic because it is understood by God. And being able to say that, I think, gives you an incredibly supple approach to the universe, because it means I don't need to know everything, which is good news because I don't. I can pretend I do, but I don't really. So I don't have to say that things are fundamentally chaotic. There are islands of coherence within a sea of chaos. I don't have to say that. But neither do I have to claim, in order to be able not to say that, that I have a bulletproof grasp of the whole of reality, that there's no corner of the universe that's going to turn up that's going to surprise my epistemology. And I think both of those are really inadequate and, at the end of the day, let's use the word silly ways to engage with the world.
He's de-escalated things here a bit.
Yeah, there are mysteries that are known, and I don't know them.
Yeah. So the title of the book is Biblical Critical Theory, okay? And I know that you've probably had a lot of discussions about this. It's the elephant in the room. I think it can suck all the air out of the room, and so I don't want to do that. This is why I'm getting to it at almost 50 minutes here. But in America, especially, and among conservative Christians, critical theory has a certain set of connotations here. Like, this is a term we've talked a lot about recently, and we have a lot of strong opinions about. And along comes this book that says biblical critical theory on the front. Now, I know a lot of people are looking at that and completely missing what the subject of the book is about. Could you kind of explain that title and then why you use a critical theory framework to attack kind of the world's way of looking at things?
There are different meanings of critical theory. One of them has become really prominent recently. And, we can be forgiven if we haven't been in philosophical circles for a long time, of thinking that that's the only meaning. It's the only meaning that we ever come across in the news media. And so when people today hear critical theory, they think, very reasonably, oh, that you must mean critical race theory and the sort of Frankfurt School critical theory that came up in the early 20th century in Germany and that used a form of Marxism to critique culture. That's what you must mean. But so I did a unit as an undergraduate called Modern Critical Theory. We didn't touch the Frankfurt School. We didn't touch critical race theory. There's a broader sense of critical theory that in a sense is older than this more narrow sense that dominates today, which is the ability to take a critical view of society, which means that you can take a step back from the way things are and stand somewhere that allows you to say society is not right in these particular areas, and this is how it should be made better. And in order to do that, you need somewhere to stand that's not the status quo. And that's where Christianity comes into its own. If you look historically at where that sort of thinking begins, who takes a step back from a culture, finds somewhere coherent to stand that's not the everyday life of that culture itself, and critiques that culture globally from this standpoint, I think you would struggle to go back further than Augustine's City of God. I think that is the origin of this broader sense of cultural critique in the West. And of course, he's drawing on the prophetic critique of the Old Testament, and there's a rich cultural critique in the New Testament as well, Jesus excoriating the Pharisees and so forth. But the reason that it's so compelling and coherent from a Christian point of view is that we do have a standpoint outside the status quo from which meaningfully and authoritatively to critique the way things are, which again comes from this idea that the Christian view of the world is a narrative. So we're living in the last days. The last days is not the whole of reality. There was a bunch of stuff that happened before we got to the last days, creation and fall, and there's going to be something that happens afterwards, redemption. And so Christianity provides you with what you might call this standpoint of redemption. We know how things should be. We know how things will be. And that gives you a perspective from which to critique society, to do critical theory. And there's a very interesting moment towards the end of Theodor Adorno's book, Minima Moralia. So he's a member of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, this narrower sense that sort of dominates today. And towards the end of that book, he says, what we really need is a standpoint of redemption. Now, he's not meaning it in a Christian sense. He's not sort of opening the door to Christianity at that point. He has a way of framing that is very not theological.
But he knows how the geometry works. He knows he needs a third point or a foothold.
That's right, absolutely. And the very fact that he reaches for that theological language is really interesting, because you do. You need somewhere to stand that is not exhaustively informed by the status quo or by the society in which you're living, in order meaningfully and in a way that you want to have weight for people to say this is not how things should be. And Christianity provides that. So there's a sense in which, both historically speaking and logically speaking, Christianity is the beating heart, or the Judeo-Christian tradition is the beating heart of the thing that we call critical theory today. And so part of the reason for choosing that as the title is to reclaim that, to say, this is an Augustinian thing. Now, the way that it's being done in the Frankfurt School, of course, is not transparently Augustinian. And there are frameworks informing that particular way of doing Christian theory that are not Christian. So I'm not suggesting that, critical race theory is Christian or anything like that. But nevertheless, on the broader spectrum, the very idea of doing something like critical theory relies on assumptions that it is very hard to get to if you don't have, for example, the creator-creature distinction and a storied view of reality that suggests that the way things are is not the way that they should be. Otherwise, you find yourself bootstrapping yourself out of reality. So that's there are a number of reasons why the title was chosen. That's one of the key ones, I think. And it's really important, therefore, for Christians to realize that when we engage with these critical theories, we're not sort of walking into some weird enemy territory that Christianity has nothing to do with. These very theories, the impetus and dynamic behind them, are planted in theological soil and relying upon and trying to rework theological assumptions and impulses for their own purposes. This is something that we as Christians have throughout the centuries of the church done, and done well. This is not some weird thing that's just popped up in the last 100 years or so.
This gets us to, and I want to, before we close, I do want to tackle at least one more of the false dichotomies, especially the one on ultimate reality being love and personal. I think that was extraordinarily powerful, and it provides a great example. But this leads me to ask a question that I was going to save for the end here, and that's, there's a discussion here I think needs to be had about whether a book like this makes sense. And I think it comes down to a question of confidence. So when I went through Del Tackett's Truth Project, and I went to the Focus on the Family Institute, where he kind of retaught that in person, he used to ask this question: do you really believe that what you believe is really real? And there's a confidence that you hear in a statement like that I'm not sure many Christians could actually say with their gut in it, could actually affirm full-heartedly. Do you sense that that kind of confidence among Christians, that we actually have the best and truest story to offer and that we can out-narrate all the narratives? Or is there some kind of groundwork we need to lay before we can start using these techniques? And do we have to evangelize ourselves before we can evangelize the world, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I think that final question is the easiest of all the ones you've just answered. Absolutely. My goodness me. Yes. I think we are bad judges of what we believe. So if you ask us what we believe, I think we find it hard to articulate authentically what we believe. I think the best judge of what we believe is what we do. So you turn the volume down on our language and you say, let's just look at your life. What does that show that you believe? How does the way you use your money and your time, the way you relate to people, what assumptions does that reflect about the way you see the world? And I think that's a much more incisive index of what we really believe than what we say when you ask us, what do we believe? In a sense, our actions don't lie, whereas we can easily deceive ourselves in terms of what we think we're doing. Not that what we think we're doing is unimportant, but I think often we can say, I believe one set of things and actually act in a way that shows that we don't really. Whether we're Christian or secular, I think we all prey to that lack of self-understanding. And so, yes, we absolutely do need to be evangelizing ourselves daily to try and grasp the as Paul says in his doxology, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. That we're only ever, Augustine was only ever scratching the surface of. And he's one of the greatest minds in the history of the Christian church. I think I just answered the easiest bit of the question, but dodged the rest of it. Remind me what you were asking.
Well, the question,
broadly.
Part of it was set up, but the question is really about whether we have the confidence to use these kinds of tools in a way that's going to be effective. And I think this maybe gets to the dual purpose of apologetics that everyone has always kind of acknowledged, right? That we are doing apologetics in order to convince the unbeliever, but we're also doing apologetics in order to reinforce the faith of those already convinced. It's that I believe, Lord, help my unbelief posture that we find in the Gospels. And that's something that I struggle with myself because I read some of these dichotomies and I think my life tells me that I kind of believe, that I kind of buy into this false dichotomy, that I haven't fully embraced Christianity's diagonalized answer, the full intensity of both at the same time, while also recognizing the foolishness of the world's way of doing it. And so I guess I'm just asking a practical question about how we get to the point of having the confidence necessary to use tools this powerful and this bold, if I can put it that way.
I think part of it is pursuing the so what question. So we have a biblically informed sense as Christians of what is real. God is not the same as creation. There's this creator-creature distinction that God is one God in three persons, and that God is love, as John says, and that he created the world seemingly not because he had to, but because he, out of love, as far as we can tell. Okay, so that's a body of doctrinal knowledge. But that has earth-shattering implications for how we do society and how we think about human beings and how we hold ourselves in the world. And I think one of the things that we need to pursue doggedly are these so what questions. So I believe these things about reality, but what does a life that is shaped by those things look like in the area of society or in the area of family, for example? And I think it's often quite hard. It needs quite a lot of work to trace through these fundamental doctrines. And, God did not need to create the universe. He did so out of love. So what? Like, what does that mean for how I engage in my local soccer club? What does that mean for where I spend my discretionary money? And there aren't easy answers to that, but there are profound, rich answers to those sort of questions. And I think we just need to pursue them meaningfully. And by we, I mean the whole church. Like, I don't think any individual Christian can just sort of sit down, shut the door and say, right, here's the whole Bible and here's the whole of my life, and let's ask the so what question, because we've all got different skills. Like, I'm I can do philosophy a bit, and that's my sort of contribution, if you like. But there's whole swathes of human experience that I haven't got a clue about. And so we need other people to be working through in their particular areas of expertise. And everybody has, a unique place in the world, unique set of experiences and relationships. So no one can do this exhaustively for another. And so as a church, we need to work together and ask this big so what question about what do these doctrines look like if they're shaping a way of being in the world and a way of shaping a community.
I can't emphasize enough, folks, that we have just scratched the surface of the book that itself just scratches the surface of the depths of the wisdom of God. There's a lot of sort of mysteries within mysteries here, but this is a fantastic attempt at doing this. I want to give us a couple of bonus minutes here on the podcast and fulfill the promise that I made earlier, which was that we would tackle at least one more dichotomy. So instead of me telling you what we should do, although I loved the ultimate reality as personal and love one, give me your favorite one. Out of all these dichotomies that you sort of deal with, is there one that just, I love the one you gave earlier, is there one that just really sticks out in your mind as a powerful demonstration of the ability of this technique to unlock things?
Oh, Shane, which of my children do I like best? What a cruel question. Look, I'm not sure whether it's my favorite one or not, but one that I think has a great potential to be part of the way in which we address the political situation in which we find ourselves. So I suppose this is one of the ones that I think is perhaps most timely, rather than necessarily my favorite, is the way in which the two ends of the political spectrum today seem, at least in part, to be taking two aspects of God's character and setting themselves up against each other. To schematize and to make it simpler than it ought to be if we're doing this properly. It's God's justice on one side against God's grace on the other. So, in terms of criminal justice, it's the lock them up and throw away the key position on one side. You've done the crime, you should do the time. Against the, let's try and understand the causes and rehabilitate people and offer them grace and try and get them back in the community as soon as possible on the other side. Yeah, I know that this is schematic and that there are exceptions. And I'm just trying to trace in some big building blocks really quickly. And there's a really interesting book, not written by a Christian at all, written by a guy called George Lakoff. And he has this idea that the two fundamental political, social imaginaries today, so not the policies, but the assumptions and the way of looking at the world that inform those policies, are based, in his view, on two views of the family. Now, we can take that or leave it, but I think the sense that there are two fundamental social imaginaries is really important. He says on one side, and he would put this on the right of the political spectrum, there's what he calls a strict father morality. That justice should reign, that there should be a strictness about how people are dealt with, and so forth. And then on the other side, he says there's a nurturant parent morality, which is, we should try and understand people and get alongside them and help them and so forth. And there's a really interesting passage in that book where he says there are these two Christianities. There's one Christianity that majors on the justice of God, sometimes the fatherhood of God, the God who's distant, the God who's authoritative. And there's another flavor of Christianity, he says, that majors on God's grace, and that God is human like us, suffers like us.
It's kind of the two halves of that famous Eastern icon with Jesus with the wonky eye, where one side is kind of the mean, eternal figure, and the other side's like the meek and mild human figure. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also, back to Chesterton, it's also, God is fully God and God is fully man, that we've taken those, wrenched them apart from each other and set them against each other. Now, he just leaves it there. But I think as a Christian, what we would want to do reflecting on that passage is think, wait a minute, neither of those are the full-orbed biblical vision of God, because God is a God of grace. You cannot read through the New Testament and not have grace rubbed in your face time and time again. But God is also the God of justice, who will not let the guilty go unpunished. And you can't read the New Testament without realizing that either. And so what we'd want to do as fully orbed biblical Christians is hold the whole of God's character together and not say that God is just to the exclusion of grace or that God is gracious to the exclusion of justice. And so to diagonalize that political divide is, again, to say, you're both trying to grasp at something that's not unreasonable to grasp at. Like, it's there. Yeah, without justice, society falls apart. But without grace, society becomes inhuman. And the $64,000 question then is, how on earth do you have both? How can you uphold justice while also extending grace? And well, that's when the New Testament comes into its own, isn't it? Because, God is the one who is just, Paul says in Romans, and he goes on in the same verse, the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. So how can God both be just and the justifier? Because if he justifies sinners who have faith in Jesus, he's not being just, surely. And if he's just, he can't be gracious. Well, the Bible is the wonderful answer to that question. And so there's a roadmap there for understanding how the political instincts of the left and right, broadly conceived, there's more to say about it, but let's just start here, both find their home in a biblical frame, but in a way that they would never imagine. And so again, there's this 1 Corinthians 1 dynamic. It's like the wisdom that I'm presenting to you, dear Greeks, is not what you think of wisdom as. You have to completely repent of your preconception of what wisdom must look like in order to embrace God's wisdom that is actually wiser than any wisdom you've ever dreamed of. So there's not just a linear progression from what you think you're looking for to what you end up with. And similarly, it's not that, come, people of the left and right politically, and you will find exactly what you've always been looking for in the Bible. No, there's a repentance, there's a metanoia that's necessary there. But there's also the sense that the thing that you have been imperfectly grasping for and that you value finds its fullest blossoming in this biblical ecosystem. Oh, and by the way, the things that the other guys that you hate are also seeking finds its blossoming alongside it. And you're going to find that extremely uncomfortable. And you're going to think that this is some wishy-washy sort of let's keep everybody happy sort of compromise because you're so hidebound in your particular way of looking at the world that you can't see beyond it. But the biblical invitation at that point is if you can get outside your own blinkers, and this is what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 1 again. Greeks, if you can contemplate the possibility that there's a wisdom that doesn't conform to your preconception of what wisdom must be in order to be counted as wisdom, then let me show you something that'll blow your mind. And I think that's one way of trying to diagnose the current political system and situation from a biblical point of view. Now, whenever one talks politics, one gets inundated with lots of critique, and there are many more things to say. There are threads that I've left open that need tying up, but that's just a short version of what it might look like to do this with the current political scene.
It's actually a perfect example to pick because the Colson Center has roots in prison fellowship and Chuck Colson's work. And one of the ways that he always irked conservatives was that Chuck went out there and said, hey, yeah, we need robust criminal justice, but we also need justice reform so that we address the root causes of the crime, not just lock them up and throw away the key. And that was a game changer for me when I first came into contact with that in college when I interned for prison fellowship. Well, we're more than out of time, but this has been a discussion that I have been wanting to get to for some time now, ever since I heard about the book. And then as soon as I started reading it, it was just like, this has got to happen, because I think what you've done here is extraordinary. It's expansive and it defies simple description. Like, many people will want to sort of oversimplify what you're doing, and it definitely cannot be oversimplified. It's very easy to do that. People should not do that. People should encounter it, read it, carefully grapple with what you're saying, because what you're saying has a tremendous amount of biblical wisdom, and it's enriched my thinking just encountering it, as I have 207 pages in. So thank you, Dr. Watkin.
Shane, it's been such a joy speaking with you. Thank you for your wonderful manner and the really incisive questions you've asked. I've had a ball.
My guest today has been Dr. Christopher Watkin, author of the new book, Biblical Critical Theory: How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Modern Life and Culture. Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media and find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.